The rain on that mountain ridge in eastern Afghanistan did not fall like rain. It fell like punishment, cold and sideways, hammering into the faces of 8 Navy SEALs who had just realized that one of their own had sold them out. Petty Officer First Class Hospital Corpsman Elena Vargas lay on her side behind a shattered boulder, her left thigh torn open by shrapnel, her trauma kit soaked red, her rifle still warm against her cheek. 30 meters across the valley, the man who had worn her same uniform for 3 deployments was waving her team into a kill box, and he had no idea she was still alive to see it. Every operator around her was either pinned, wounded, or dragging someone who could no longer walk. The shot was impossible. The angle was wrong, the wind was wrong, her leg was going numb, and the range was at the ragged edge of what her weapon could do. But if she did not take it, her brothers would die believing a lie. So ask yourself this before we go any further, and tell me honestly in the comments. If the person betraying your team was someone you once trusted with your life, could you still pull that trigger? Because Elena did. And what happened in the 14 seconds before she squeezed, it is a story the Navy almost buried forever. Elena Vargas did not grow up dreaming of war. She grew up in a trailer outside Bakersfield, California, the youngest of 4, the only girl. Raised by a mother who cleaned hotel rooms at night, and a father who disappeared into a bottle before her 10th birthday. Her brothers taught her how to throw a punch, how to change a tire, and how to hide bruises under long sleeves. But it was her grandmother, a woman who had fled El Salvador with nothing but a rosary and a folded photograph, who taught her the one thing that would later save her life. Her grandmother told her that a person who runs toward pain when everyone else runs away is not brave. She is simply honest about what the world needs. Elena held on to those words through every humiliation of high school, through the shifts at the diner where men twice her age leaned too close, through the night her oldest brother came home from Iraq with both legs gone below the knee and eyes that no longer recognized the kitchen. She was 17 when she sat beside his hospital bed and watched a Navy corpsman change his dressings with hands so steady and so kind that her brother, for the first time in months, laughed. That corpsman was a woman, maybe 24, with a name tape that read Mitchell, and when Elena asked her what she did for a living, Mitchell said, "I keep the people who save the world from dying while they do it." Elena enlisted 3 days after graduation. Boot camp broke her down the way it breaks everyone, but corpsman school nearly ended her. The anatomy was brutal, the pace inhuman, and the instructors took particular interest in the quiet Latina who never complained and never cried in front of them. What they did not know was that she cried alone, every single night for the first 6 weeks, into a pillow she washed every Saturday, because she refused to let the evidence show. She graduated in the top 5 of her class. Her first assignment was a Marine Infantry battalion, and within 18 months she had treated 17 combat casualties, lost 2. And earned a reputation for being the corpsman who would crawl under fire to reach a man she did not know. It was there, in a dusty aid station in Helmand, that a grizzled SEAL Master Chief saw her work and told her something no one had ever said to her before. He said, "The teams need people like you, and if you are willing to be the first, I will sponsor you myself." She did not sleep that night. She thought about her grandmother. She thought about her brother. She thought about the woman named Mitchell. And in the morning, she said yes. The pipeline to become a Special Operations Independent Duty Corpsman attached to a SEAL team was not designed for women when Elena began it. And it showed in every mile of every run and every minute of every dive. She was not trying to become a SEAL, a distinction she made clear to anyone who asked, because the combat roles had only recently opened and the politics around them were poison. She was training to be the medic who kept them breathing, the one who would jump from the same helicopter, swim the same distance, carry the same ruck, and then do the one thing none of them could do, which was keep a torn artery closed in the dark with 2 fingers while a firefight raged 6 feet away. The first school broke her ankle. She taped it, lied about it, and finished. The second school nearly drowned her during a pool competency evaluation when an instructor held her underwater past what was comfortable to see if she would panic. She did not panic. She went limp, conserved oxygen, and waited. When he let her up, he looked at her for a long moment, and then walked away without a word. She later learned he had recommended her for advancement that same afternoon. The men in her classes were not cruel, most of them, but they were watchful, and watchfulness is its own kind of pressure. Every time she stumbled, every time she needed a second attempt, she felt the weight of every woman who would come after her resting on whether she got back up. She got back up. She learned to shoot a pistol from a moving boat, to insert a chest tube in complete darkness, to speak passable Dari and enough Pashto to calm a frightened child, and to carry a 200-pound operator on her shoulders across sand for a full mile without setting him down. When she finally checked into her first SEAL platoon, Team 5 out of Coronado, the chief looked at her orders, looked at her, and said only, "We do not care what you are, we care what you do. And what you do had better be excellent." She met her team that afternoon in a briefing room that smelled of coffee and gun oil. There were 16 of them, and she memorized every name, every face, every small detail, because her grandmother had taught her that people who feel seen fight harder for you. There was Chief Dalton, a 42-year-old Montanan who spoke in complete sentences perhaps 3 times a week. There was Lieutenant Reyes, the officer in charge, young and sharp and fair. There was a sniper named Koa from Hawaii who called her sister from the first day, and a communicator named Briggs who did not. And then there was Petty Officer Second Class Marcus Hale, a 6'4" former college wrestler from outside Nashville with a grin that arrived 3 seconds before he did and a handshake that felt like a promise. Hale was the one who showed her where the good coffee was hidden, who covered for her the first time she was late, who told her on her 3rd night that the team would either accept her or they would not, but he already had. She believed him. For 3 years, she believed him completely. Their first deployment together was to the Horn of Africa, and it was, by the brutal standards of that decade, almost quiet. They did presence patrols, trained local partner forces, and ran a handful of direct action missions that ended cleanly. Elena treated heat casualties, a shrapnel wound from a vehicle-borne device, and 1 catastrophic gunshot to the neck that she kept alive for 47 minutes until the medevac arrived. Long enough for the operator to see his wife again before he died on the table in Djibouti. She wept in the shower that night, and then she went back to work. The second deployment was harder, a rotation through Iraq during a period the public was told had ended. And it was there that she first began to notice small things about Marcus Hale that did not add up. He was gone for longer than he should have been on a resupply run. He had a second phone that he kept in a pouch she had never seen him open. He asked questions during mission briefs that felt, in hindsight, less like preparation and more like collection. She told herself she was being paranoid. She told herself that 3 years of friendship, of covering each other during ambushes, of Christmas dinners at his mother's house in Tennessee, while she was too far from her own family to travel, meant something. She told herself that the man who had held her hand at Chief Dalton's funeral after a training accident claimed him, who had looked at her with red eyes and said, "We are all we have," could not possibly be what her instincts were beginning to whisper. By the time they rotated to eastern Afghanistan for what everyone assumed would be a final, quiet tour before the official withdrawal, Elena had buried her suspicions so deep she could almost pretend they had never surfaced. The mission that would end everything was a high-value target interdiction in a village tucked into a valley near the Pakistani border. Intelligence suggested a mid-level financier for a regional network was meeting couriers there, and the team was inserted by helicopter 3 kilometers out, moving on foot under a moonless sky. Elena carried her aid bag, her rifle, 60 pounds of mission-essential gear, and the same small laminated photograph of her grandmother she had carried on every operation since her first. The insertion went perfectly. The approach went perfectly. And then, at the moment the team crossed the final ridge line before the objective, everything that could go wrong went wrong in a sequence so precise that later, sitting in a debriefing room in Bagram, Lieutenant Reyes would say aloud what everyone had already understood. Someone told them we were coming. The initial burst of machine gun fire came from an elevated position that should not have been occupied. It cut down 2 operators in the first 3 seconds. Elena was hit in the left thigh by a piece of shrapnel from a rocket-propelled grenade that detonated against the boulder beside her, and she went down hard, her aid bag flying forward, her rifle still on its sling. Through the smoke and the screaming, she saw something that made her entire body go cold. On the opposite ridge, lit for a single instant by the flash of a secondary explosion, she saw Marcus Hale standing upright, unharmed, speaking calmly into a radio that was not their radio, gesturing toward the position where her team had taken cover. For a long moment, Elena did not move, and it was not the wound that held her still. It was the architecture of everything she had believed for 3 years collapsing inward at once. Marcus was not captured. He was not being coerced. He was standing in the open because he knew the men on the opposite ridge would not shoot him. And the only reason they would not shoot him was because he had given them every piece of information they needed to kill her team. She thought of the second phone. She thought of the questions. She thought of 100 small moments that now rearranged themselves into a pattern so obvious she wanted to scream for having missed it. Then she thought of Lieutenant Reyes, who was 50 meters to her left, pinned behind a low stone wall with 3 wounded men. Trying to call in close air support on a radio that she now understood was almost certainly compromised. She dragged herself behind the boulder, pulled a tourniquet from her belt, and applied it to her own thigh with hands that refused to shake because she would not permit them to. She keyed her radio, and she did something that would later be studied at the Naval Special Warfare Center as one of the coldest pieces of battlefield reasoning in the modern record. She did not announce what she had seen. She did not say Hale's name. She assumed the net was compromised, and she transmitted in the private family code she and Reyes had developed over 2 deployments for situations exactly like this. A handful of phrases drawn from a shared obsession with a television show neither of them would admit to watching. She said, "The Red Wedding is live." Repeat, "The Red Wedding is live." And on the other end of the line, Lieutenant Reyes, a man who had never in his life raised his voice in combat, said one word back. "Copy." She crawled. The tourniquet held, but the pain was a living thing, and every meter she moved across that broken ground opened the wound further. She reached a position 40 meters from the boulder where Marcus still stood, still speaking, still betraying them, and she settled her rifle into a notch in the rocks. The range was 460 meters by her estimate. The wind was from her left at perhaps 15 miles an hour, gusting. Her optic was fogged from the rain and her own breath. Her left leg was shaking uncontrollably now, and she could feel the warmth of blood pooling inside her trouser. Sniper Koa was 200 meters away with the better weapon and the better angle, but Koa was pinned down returning fire on the ambushers, and Koa did not know what she knew. If she called it over the net, Marcus would hear it and vanish into the mountains with every secret he had ever stolen from them, and her team would die not knowing why. If she waited to be sure, the fire support he was coordinating would arrive, and there would be nothing left of her brothers to bury. She breathed in. She breathed out. She thought of her grandmother, of the corpseman named Mitchell, of her brother's legs, of every small kindness Marcus had ever shown her, and how every one of them had been a lie paid for with other men's lives. She placed her finger on the trigger, and for 14 seconds she did not move, because she needed to be absolutely certain that what she was about to do was justice and not grief. The shot, when it came, was the cleanest she had ever fired in her life. It struck Marcus Hale in the upper chest, and he went down without a sound, the radio falling from his hand onto the wet stone beside him. For perhaps 2 seconds, the entire valley seemed to pause, as if the mountains themselves were deciding what to make of what had just happened. Then Lieutenant Reyes, who had understood every syllable of her coded warning, shifted the team's fire onto the ambush positions with a precision that suggested he had already been repositioning his men while she crawled. The enemy on the opposite ridge, suddenly without their coordinator, without their eyes, without the man who had been telling them exactly where every SEAL was hiding, began to lose cohesion within a minute. A pair of F-16s that had been holding at altitude finally received clean coordinates from Reyes on a backup frequency he had switched to the instant Elena's transmission reached him, and the ambush positions ceased to exist in a rolling sequence of detonations that Elena felt more than heard, because by then she was losing a great deal of blood and the edges of her vision were beginning to narrow. She remembered Koa reaching her, his face close to hers, his hands moving over her leg with the rough competence of a man who had learned trauma care from her. She remembered him saying, "Stay with me, sister, stay with me." And she remembered laughing, or trying to, because it struck her as absurd that after everything, she might die in the care of a student she had taught. She did not die. The medevac reached her 40 minutes later, and she was on an operating table in Bugram before the sun came up. She lost a great deal of muscle in her thigh, and she would walk with a slight hesitation for the rest of her life, but she kept the leg, and she kept her career. And for a long time, those two facts were the only things she allowed herself to feel gratitude for. The investigation that followed was conducted with a quietness that surprised her until she understood its purpose. Marcus Hale had been communicating with a foreign intelligence service for at least 18 months. He had provided routes, rosters, timing, biometric data, and the names of local informants who were subsequently executed. He had done it, the investigators eventually determined, for money and for a grievance so petty that when Elena finally read the summary, she sat alone in a hospital garden and wept. Not for him, but for every man his greed had buried. 3 operators from her team had died in the initial ambush. 2 more would die of their wounds in the following week. The team that remained, the team that had survived, received their medals in a private ceremony closed to the press. And Elena received a silver star with a citation so heavily redacted that her mother, reading it at the kitchen table in Bakersfield, looked up and asked her what any of it actually meant. Elena, who had been taught by her grandmother to be honest about what the world needs, told her the only thing she could tell her, which was that she had done her job, and that the cost of doing it had been higher than she knew how to explain. She did not leave the Navy. Many people, including 2 chaplains and a very kind psychiatrist at Walter Reed, assumed she would, and for a long time she assumed it herself. She spent 6 months in physical therapy learning to run again on a leg that no longer entirely trusted her. And she spent those same 6 months in conversations with a counselor who specialized in operators returning from catastrophic missions. What she learned in those rooms was harder than anything the pipeline had taught her. She learned that the betrayal of a trusted teammate is a wound that does not close the way a bullet wound closes, because it requires you to grieve not only the people you lost but the version of yourself that had been foolish enough to love the person who killed them. She learned that forgiveness was not the goal, because forgiveness was not hers to give on behalf of men who had died. She learned that the goal was something smaller and more useful, which was to take what she now knew about trust, about vigilance, about the small signs she had ignored, and to give that knowledge to the people coming up behind her so they would not have to learn it the way she had. She requested orders to the Naval Special Warfare Preparatory School, and she spent the next 4 years teaching combat medicine and situational awareness to the youngest corpsmen in the pipeline, including, eventually, the first 2 women to complete the full course after her. She told them everything. She told them about Marcus. She told them about the phone she had seen and not questioned, about the questions during briefs she had dismissed, about the 3 years of friendship that had cost 5 men their lives. She told them that the finest operators she had ever known were not the strongest or the fastest, but the ones who paid attention, and that paying attention was a discipline, not a gift. She was promoted to Chief Petty Officer in a ceremony at which Lieutenant Reyes, now a commander, pinned her anchors on with hands that, for once, were not perfectly steady. Cole was there. 3 of the other survivors were there. The empty spaces where the others should have stood were also there, and no one pretended otherwise. She deployed twice more in advisory roles, and she was, by every account of those who served with her, the finest teacher the community had produced in a generation. She never remarried, having been briefly and unhappily married during her second deployment, and she never had children of her own, but the corpsmen she trained came to her wedding when they married, and brought their babies to her house in Coronado, and called her on the anniversary of the ambush every year, because she had told them once that no one should be alone on that date, and she had meant it. Chief Petty Officer Elena Vargas retired from the United States Navy after 22 years of service, with a Silver Star, 2 Bronze Stars with Valor, a Purple Heart, and a limp she never tried to hide. She lives now in a small house near the ocean, not far from the base where her career began, and she volunteers 3 days a week at a veterans clinic where she works with amputees, the way the corpsman named Mitchell once worked with her brother. Her grandmother's rosary hangs above her kitchen sink. The laminated photograph she carried on every mission sits in a frame on her desk, beside a second frame containing the names of the 5 men who did not come home from that valley in eastern Afghanistan. She speaks of Marcus Hale rarely, and when she does, she speaks of him without hatred, because hatred, she has learned, is a weight the living cannot afford to carry on behalf of the dead. What her story represents is not, in the end, the shot she took at 460 meters with a wounded leg and a broken heart. It is everything that led to that shot, the grandmother who taught her to run toward pain, the brother who came home without his legs, the corpseman who showed her what a woman could be, the instructors who did not let her quit, the team that did not let her fail, and the quiet, unglamorous decision she made every single day for 2 decades to pay attention to the people around her. The lesson she leaves is the one she gives every student on their last day with her. She tells them that courage is not the absence of fear or doubt, or even love for the people who betray you. Courage is doing the right thing anyway, with shaking hands, in the rain, when no one is watching and no one will ever fully understand. And if her story reaches one young woman tonight who is wondering whether she is strong enough for the life she is being called to, Elena would want her to know the answer. You are. You always were.